Hello, welcome. Thanks for joining us this evening. You have arrived at the webinar, Songs from the Ashes, Wildfire and Bird Communities, presented by the Laguna Foundation and the Bird Rescue Center. Hello, good evening. Thank you for joining us for Songs from the Ashes, where we will learn more about the effects of smoke and flame on bird populations and what happens in a bird rescue center during and after a wildfire. We will also hear behind the scenes stories of bird rescue and unique avian observations from the last few years of fire-heavy years. If you haven't already, please say hello in the chat box and let us know where you're tuning in from today. My name is Christine Fontaine. I'm the Education Director here at the Laguna de Santa Rosa Foundation. I'd like to begin this place-based program with a land acknowledgement. A land acknowledgement is a formal statement that recognizes and respects Indigenous peoples as traditional stewards of this land and their enduring relationship with their homelands. The Laguna watershed sits within the homeland of Coast Miwok and Southern Pomo people. To raise awareness for ancestral and current Indigenous peoples' presence in the Laguna watershed, we pay our respect to the past, present, and future generations of Coast Miwok and Southern Pomo people, along with their Wapo neighbors. I share this acknowledgement to speak to past wrongs and to demonstrate our gratitude for the honor of working for the well-being of the Laguna de Santa Rosa. If you'd like to know more about the Indigenous land you live on, visit the Native Land website at native-land.ca. Again, thanks for joining us tonight. Feel free to drop your name and where you're tuning in from today into the chat. The Laguna de Santa Rosa is a nonprofit organization based in Santa Rosa that works to restore, conserve, and inspire appreciation for the Laguna de Santa Rosa. The Laguna is a wetland and a 22-mile-long waterway, as well as an entire watershed that encompasses Santa Rosa, Cotati, Rohnert Park, and parts of Sebastopol and Windsor. The Laguna de Santa Rosa wetlands have been heavily impacted by development on the Santa Rosa Plain that led to complex challenges that drive our restoration, conservation, and education work today. Despite those challenges, the Laguna is a biodiversity hotspot, home to endangered plants and animals, and it has a very special designation of being a wetland of international importance. One of only 34 sites in the United States with this honor. We work to restore the special wetlands through conservation science projects, planting native trees, shrubs, and forbs, managing invasive species, and increasing knowledge and appreciation of the Laguna through our youth and community programs like this webinar today. We do this important work of conserving this watershed, restoring habitat, and educating future generations through collaboration and partnerships with other local organizations like the Bird Rescue Center. I encourage you to visit their website, birdrescuecenter.org, to see how you can get involved in their commitment to provide care and comfort to our native wild bird populations and to create an unparalleled and sustainable new facility. This presentation is being recorded and it will be available to view on our YouTube channel in a few days. During the presentation, feel free to ask questions in the chat box. You can direct your chat either to the panelists, myself and Ashton, or to all participants by choosing either option in the gray drop-down box above where you type your message. We will have time for questions and answers following the presentation. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Ashton Kluttz, the Executive Director at the Bird Rescue Center of Sonoma County. Ashton holds a BA in Environmental Studies from Washington College in Maryland. She began her tenure with the Bird Rescue Center in 2010 and her career as a wildlife rehabilitator in 2009 with the Marine Mammal Center, where she served in the Stranding Department. Striving to provide the best care for our local wildlife, she obtained her Registered Veterinary Technician certification in 2018. Ashton co-authored a chapter on towhee care that is included in a wildlife care book used in facilities around the world. And she serves on the board of the California Council for Wildlife Rehabilitators that provides community protocols and information to all California wildlife facilities. Join me in welcoming Ashton Kluttz.
Thank you, Christine, and thank you everybody for having us here from Bird Rescue. It's been an exciting process to have this collaboration, especially on a topic that really involves all species, all wildlife, and all wild lands. So let me go ahead and do my share screen here. All right. In case you are not familiar with Bird Rescue, we have a twofold mission, which is to rescue, rehabilitate, and release injured, ill, or orphaned native wild birds. We also educate the public regarding the importance of the ecological effects of those birds with our resident ambassadors that are non-releasable. In this photo, you can see our wonderful Quonset hut that we work out of, which has been there for the past 40 some odd years, as long as we have been on that site. Our history in the community stems from a group of concerned citizens that wanted to know what to do with a bird that they found. And one of our founders, pictured up in the corner, Martha Bentley, she, as well as Madrone Audubon Society and the County of Sonoma, were able to effectively form a more formal group to incorporate as Bird Rescue Center in 1976 and obtain the Quonset hut and about quarter to half acre where we still exist today. We have grown since then, so we now assist Lake and Mendocino counties and support our sister organizations in Napa and Marin counties as well. We aid in specialized care for things like towhees, which we've been published on, as well as other sort of difficult species in a rehab setting, as well as flight evaluations, pre-release assessments, and basically helping our fellow organizations in any way that we can to promote wild birds returning to their homes. Our usual education program involves over 90 different events from schools, fairs, festivals, anywhere where there is want to learn about the environment, about birds, and what we can do to be the best stewards to our native areas. Since COVID has affected our education program, we haven't been able to be the stars of the show with our ambassadors, but we have been able to accommodate their mental well-being with a little bit more stimulation outside of their usual housing and taking trips around the center property. So that way they can get some sunshine and some interaction while on site. Here are our two turkey vultures, Arnold and Barf, and they are imitating our education mural as well as kind of getting some sunshine and getting some time outside. This is a picture of our main baby bird room. So it's kind of what I refer to as our loudmouth ward. So we have jays, robins, woodpeckers, as you can see in the bottom picture, in their specialty housing. And each one of these enclosures houses multiple patients because we never want to grow a little baby up by itself. We want them to grow together as a group and then be released as kind of their own little family unit. These stats I have for 2020 are here on the screen. And even with the pandemic, we've been open the whole time. We received 2,653 birds last year overall. 200 birds were consistently in care from June through August, and the most patients in one day was a record of 44. This year, we've already had 1,418 birds checked right before this presentation, and we're averaging about 20 to 30 birds per day already, which is a little bit above average. We're about 30% more birds so far this year in our hospital than the previous 5 years combined. We generally have about 120 different species come through our doors, and already this year we've seen 116. So normally that is about right, where 110 to 15 are kind of our usual suspects, and then we have some species first or some rarities every so often. So this little bird was a chipping sparrow. It came from another facility that needed a little group to grow up with. So we were able to pair it with some juncos, and we're able to find a little tiny hotspot of where some chipping sparrows live in the county, and we're able to release them all into a group there. Not a rarity, but certainly a cutie. This is a baby northern pygmy owl. They are the smallest owl in our area, and they get to be about the size of a puffy golf ball. We were able to reunite this little one with its family in Armstrong Woods. Our usual suspects in terms of raptors are things like Cooper's hawks on the left, red-shouldered hawks like in the middle, and plenty of barn owls like on the right. We've already so far this year released, I think, 6 or 10 barn owls that came from hay trucks from various areas. So we've been able to raise them to a certain point and then get them into an owl box, and then they're kind of fed until they're ready to explore on their own out in the wild. This was not a species first, but kind of an age first for us last year. This was a baby golden eagle, and we typically get juvenile or adult eagles in the winter, but this was just about a year ago. And what happened was the whole nest fell down out of the tree. And in the bottom left, you can see what we recreated. It ended up that those half circle papasan chairs ended up being the perfect size and shape to fit an eagle family. And we were able to call our wonderful tree climbers and say, we know that you've dealt with potentially upset and angry mom red-tailed hawks and great horned owls. How do you feel about approaching an eagle? And they were very gung-ho, which is I might have had some reservations about, but we were able to have this baby healed from a fractured wing, as you can see in the middle photo. And 6 months later is a picture of that same bird. It was still hanging out with mom and dad and learning how to fly and hunt on its own with their assistance. And we received an update from the folks that monitor this nest on their property, and they were saying that the parents have been reusing the papasan chair, but decorating it with things like mistletoe. So I'm hoping that we'll get an update that there are some more babies this year. We are one of the only facilities in the area that does corvids of any kind. So these are some one baby crow on the left. So you can tell that it's a baby because it has baby blue eyes. They do turn brown towards the end of their first year. Some California scrub jays up in the top right, as well as one Stellar's jay who looks like his little mohawk got cut off. And then not a corvid, but a grumpy blackbird in the bottom. And all that we do in our rehabilitation hospital is to get the birds back out into the wild and released. So in just a few short weeks, we'll have our kind of big release week, which tends to be the week following 4th of July festivities. Last year was no different. We had 64 birds released back into the wild in, I think, a 5-day period. So we do, as much as we grow them up into groups so that they have kind of their own little family unit, we do try to release birds back to where they came from so that they know know the area, they know where to get food, they know where shelter is, but we also don't want to release anything in a time period that might be dangerous or scary, or that would kind of lead them not to be as most successful as possible. So this is kind of probably the most jarring photo that I put in here. I personally was affected by the Tubbs fire, so images of fire and burning is not really something that I want to see. So just in case that is on anybody's mind, this is pretty much the worst of it. I have one kind of hazy red photo that was taken last year, but no actual flames or anything. But what we discovered in the past few years from smoke and fire events is just what we have seen that is strange or oddities, what we've had to prepare for now in thinking of earlier fire seasons, unfortunately, and the communications that we've had with other facilities and things like that. So even though these are kind of anecdotal items from bird rescue, we hope that they're important in inspiring that extra thought of what goes on with our wildlife as well as ourselves during these time periods. So prior to the Tubbs fire, there seemed to be the Handling fire in 1964, with I was not here in California yet, so I had no experience with anything like that before. And in terms of when Bird Rescue Center was incorporated and on Chinook site, that was only 40 years ago, so not quite still in that mindset yet. So we had a emergency evacuation protocol meeting with a bunch of other organizations in the area that had to deal with either large animals or wild animals, and in various settings, how do you appropriately, quickly, and safely capture the animals and get them into a safer area. And we had this whole protocol set up, and we were planning on a practice that weekend, and then the Tubbs fire happened, and we actually evacuated fully from our center at 3 a.m. during the Tubbs fire. This was also our first experience with the term called AQI, or Air Quality Index, as well. So that kind of came up first in sort of smoke drift, and then something that we've been dealing with ever since, even if there's not an actual fire event immediately in our area. So just kind of as an FYI, we obviously were able to evacuate safely during the Tubbs fire, and we have had to evacuate fully once every year since. So we have now gone from having sort of a loose plan in terms of where birds are going, and we now, with the last fire, we're able to fully evacuate paperwork, all birds and everything to their designated facilities within 2 hours during this past evacuation. So we very much coordinate with every other organization in the area in terms of who's going to go where and what space is needed, and then how we can help provide either food or volunteer resources while the other organizations are housing our birds so graciously. One of those birds during the Tubbs fire was this burrowing owl. So this one came from Bodega Bay area and had been caught in barbed wire, and we were able to repair the wing. We were obviously very excited about owls very often, so we kind of went a little crazy in trying to create a burrow and making him as comfortable as possible. And then, of course, we had to evacuate. So just kind of as an FYI, since we are in baby season, this is not something that I have seen in the wild yet, but I do try to have these kind of juvenile and adult comparisons just in case you spot something in your yard where you might say, okay, you don't really look like an adult, but are you the son or daughter of some other bird that has been, poking around my feeder or other area in the yard? So on the left is the juvenile burrowing owl, and on the right is a very stern looking adult. In the process of this bird's healing, and when we got to the point where it was ready for release, we do not try to keep birds longer than they really need to, because what ends up happening is they start to injure themselves in captivity. So in order to prevent that, what we did was we did start looking at that AQI, or air quality index. Since this bird was from the coastline, we kind of monitored out in that direction for a week prior to what we felt was okay for release. And we did decide to go ahead and release this bird back into the wild, but not before checking into its natural history and seeing if it would be okay to be in an area that didn't have the most excellent oxygen quality. And because of their name, Burrowing Owl, they live in burrows. And we discovered that they actually tolerate a low level of oxygen, much lower than any other bird, or potentially any most animals, because of where they live. So we felt confident that because of this bird's natural history, we would be able to go ahead and release it safely back to where it came from. And especially during that time out towards the coast, the air quality was not as bad as it was inland. So here is his release. These two kids came to us earlier in the season, and one was from Lake County and one was from Mendocino County, and we were not able to put them back with their wild families. Either we didn't have a nest location, or we did have a nest location in one instance, but the parents hadn't been seen, and it looked like either it had been abandoned or something happened to the parents. So in trying to find where we might be able to possibly wild foster these birds, our raptor release coordinator, they reached out to birding groups, nest watch groups, and then eventually wildlife photographers, just kind of anybody that might be out and about and taking pictures to capture their fluff as well as their beauty. And we actually were able to get in contact with a wildlife photographer who had been taking notice of their own local great horned owl nest for several years. And she was able to point us in the direction of this nest, which in the middle photo there, it's right there. And then there are what we assume is one baby and one parent, because that's usually how it works. One parent stands kind of sentinel while the babies are kind of out and about and exploring. And so she knew from watching this family for so long that they always had 3 babies, and this year they only had 1. So they would be able to handle 2 wild foster babies rather than just 1, or none. So we were able to coordinate with her that she would continue to monitor and give us updates on what was going on after we put the 2 foster babies into this nest. And that way, if anything were to go wrong, if anything were to happen with the family or the 2 that we put in, we didn't want to overburden the natural parents or affect that family unit. So that way we would be able to intervene if something were to happen. So these are some of her photos throughout the summer. So this is in May, after we were able to put both of our foster babies into this nest. And here are all 3 babies together, probably taking a snooze after they got some lunch. And here in the left, you can see is 1 adult and 2 babies standing guard, and then 2 babies on the right. And she was able, because she monitored them so closely, to tell which one was the biological baby and which 2 were the wild foster babies. And they all developed very well. The parents were just excellent parents, and they grew up to be almost indistinguishable from real live adult great horned owls. And this was the last photos that we had from her in August, and then the Tubbs fire occurred. And during that time period, probably a week during the fire incident and afterwards, she was unable to locate any of the birds and was worried that something happened to them. She wasn't directly in a burn area, but very close. And so was concerned about what happened. And finally, a week later, in October, she sent us these two photos, but did confirm that the whole family had come back and they were all okay. And they did stay in that area for the rest of the fall, which is common with great horned owls. And so she was able to monitor them after the event and through the rest of the year, basically, as would be normal for babies to stick around with their parents for that period of time. Since then, though, these owls have not returned to this nest site, which is interesting because they're usually very loyal to their nesting areas. And so, between the difference of a burrowing owl, where it might be able to literally burrow, and these great horned owls, which left for a time period and then returned at least immediately to kind of finish out that nesting site period. Um, those are two different ways that wildlife could survive during a fire event. So, burrowing or hiding, flying away, running away. I read also that some large animals like elk and things like that, they may just go into a waterway or a stream and just kind of hang out until the danger is past. I remember watching the trail cams from Pepperwood where there was a deer fleeing and then almost immediately returning. Who's to say that that was the same deer, but I like to think that it was. I know that in my own yard, I also had a soft release of a mockingbird that had very distinguishable markings. And I know that I saw him or her after the event as well. So, kind of leaving and coming back. And then obviously there are some that leave and just move on and don't return as well. And unfortunately, likely those that do perish in the events too. So in our 2018 season in preparation, I looked towards Australia. They very unfortunately have a lot of experience with wildfires, and I thought maybe there's been more study of immediate after effects, especially with wildlife, and kind of what could I expect here. I learned a lot from what they were able to publish, things like the first thing to notice is bugs and all kinds of insects just kind of flood the area, and then all the rest of the animals. And kind of if animals are all going in the same direction, you should probably be going in that direction as well. They also have wild hawks that take embers or burning sticks and intentionally light wildlands on fire. So I really hope that our wildlife doesn't get too smart around here, because that would just be another thing that we would have to work around. But I was expecting, based on things that they were saying, was that we would have more cavity nesters. So things like woodpecker species, small owls, anything that might take advantage of dead or decaying or plants and trees and things like that. We didn't really have a significant increase in any of those species. It was pretty normal for what we've seen, but we did end up having a very odd experience with a few nests of finches. These are perfectly healthy finches. At the time, I did not think of taking a photo of the ones that we had seen, but finches tend to just have certain illnesses that we need to look out for in a wildlife setting. And what we were seeing with these groups that came in, they just didn't match anything in particular that we had usually dealt with. So I started looking at, where did you come from? And one group came from quite literally across the street from a fire line, one from 2 miles in every direction during the Tubbs fire. Then another, we start kind of getting farther and farther out from fire areas. But then this one was also kind of in the middle of the flood zone area, because we also had that event as well. So my guess and my hypothesis is that either the nesting material or the food that was collected to feed to the babies was contaminated in some way, and then that made them present with this strange illness that they all seem to have. And it's then kind of the question of, well, why didn't we see that in everything? Because some of them are not anywhere near an immediate fire or smoke area, but it's the same as our own immunity. So each family has its traits of underlying conditions or potential conditions that's different from, even within your own family, your own siblings, or your mother and father, different from your cousins, from your neighbors, et cetera. So even though we tend to see similarities in species of what can affect them, each individual and each individual family could be affected more than others, even with the same kind of setting or same availability of food. So here are the differences between juveniles and adults. So juvenile house finch on the left, and typically for those little birds that are still growing, you'll see these kind of, I call them little Einstein hairs. So the little finches, they have little white ones, little blackbirds have gray and that kind of thing. Doves and pigeons will have little yellow wiry hairs. They're not hairs, they're feathers, but then as they grow, they develop into either the female pictured above in her lovely dark drab brown streaky, and then our beautiful males, which are much more vibrant in order to attract the ladies. We also have yellow variants in this area, so it's not atypical to see a potential yellowy or orangey versus a red house finch. And then we also have purple finches. So this was taken from Alabama. And personally, if I see a little finchy thing that flies by very quickly and a flash of red, I will assume that it's a house finch, but I'm not the best birder. So I'd really have to actually have them in hand or be able to stare at them for quite a while to see the difference. But we do have both in this area. Another oddity that we experienced in the 2018 season following the Tubbs fire was the West 9th Street rookery birds. So we have a lot of black crowned night herons that come from this rookery in the middle of the street on West 9th, if you haven't experienced it. There are snowy egrets, cattle egrets, great egrets, little or green herons, and every now and then a great blue heron. So here is pictured black crowned night heron, juvenile and adult. And then this is what we get to see a lot of. So this is the rookery, and the City of Santa Rosa, as well as Madrone Audubon Society, they work to do the initial progress of blocking off the street, making sure there's padding down below so that when the babies come down, they have something soft to land on versus the concrete. And as you can see in the bottom picture, that is a picture of the trees. Each one of those clusters is a nest. And so putting a baby back up into the appropriate nest is nearly impossible. So the next step is that they come to bird rescue. We assess them, do initial triage, and then send them to International Bird Rescue over in Fairfield because that's what they specialize in. And then eventually we coordinate everybody to bring them back to the Laguna de Santa Rosa. So we're hopeful that they choose this much more beautiful, luscious place to live than the middle of the street. Eventually, hopefully moving the entire rookery into this more appropriate area. So what we were seeing in the 2018 season though, so they all have these beautiful long legs, and we saw that almost all of them, or a good portion of them, had issues with their bone development of their legs, their long limbs. And the kind of catch-all term is metabolic bone disease. So there's either a nutrient that's lacking or too much, or a chemical that's been introduced. Something has happened that affects their ability to form their bones properly. So sometimes this means that when they're a baby, they can't even support their own weight, and their bones bend or break under even their own weight. Or they get kind of simultaneous fractures on their legs, or so that kind of shows that just both bones are affected, and it's probably more systemic rather than just a one-time incident. So this kind of led to my thought process of why are they all coming in like this? And in terms of what we know the activity of the birds to be, is that the adults go, they hunt in the Laguna, they come back and they feed the babies. So on the top is a map of the burn area of the Tubbs fire in the Santa Rosa area, and the bottom is the Laguna watershed. So even though you may think the Laguna is one spot where you're able to go to the visitor center and things like that, the whole watershed encompasses a huge area. And so all of that was burned, and then the potential runoff has to go somewhere. And unfortunately, those kinds of events happen, and the runoff comes into our watersheds. So I grew up on the Chesapeake Bay, and that was very much ingrained in a large part of my life. And so that's what I immediately thought of, was where these birds were hunting and what was the potential that this runoff was affecting now they're young. And in speaking with International Bird Rescue, they said that they have had similar events in species that live downstream from fire events. Like one was a species that kind of never has a particular issue, and then it showed up having some sort of strange illness or injury, and sure enough, they were nesting almost immediately downstream of like the Paradise Fire. And so we have to assume that these types of events do trickle up in the environment and build up to the point where they are affecting larger species rather than just, small microbes or things like that. On sort of a bonus, we had our first ever Lazily bunting nest. So we had never had one of these before. And this giant thistle thing came in, and we were wondering, why are these juncos nesting in this nest? And that should have been the first red flag, but we were able to kind of grow them up together again with a few more little buddies. There's a baby junco blocking one of them in the left, but they have this is one of the juveniles on the right, and they have this kind of reddish burnt umber tone to them on their side. Their faces kind of more conical, and they were found just outside of a burn area. So just as reference, this is a baby junco on the left and an adult junco on the right. I personally saw a baby harassing an adult for food in my yard earlier today. And then this is the comparison of those buntings. So on the right, Cornell says that that is either a juvenile or an adult female. And then the males really steal the show. They're just gorgeous. And what we've just found out about that species was that even though they breed and migrate and winter generally in this area, they do come in and take advantage of post-fire habitats. So I tried to find the reason why that would be, but it just seems that they have evolved and this is their niche. And that seems to just be the pattern and the support system for our environment for some species to require either intense heat to be able to reproduce or be productive or actual fire events. So plants, fungi, birds. And so I would suspect that we will be seeing more of these buntings and other species that take advantage of post-fire habitats in the coming years. And obviously we have experienced now many fires in this area. And after each one, we just kind of have to think about what happened, what can we prepare for. And then this past year, we had our first adult Lazily bunting. And of course, my photos do not compare to the ones that I found online. But in listening to a talk from, I believe it was Pepperwood, where they're trying to analyze the species composition of the area and listening to birdsong, they definitely noticed more of these buntings in the area, which now, knowing their natural history, makes sense. So we've had a lot going on in the past few years, as we can see. The site was trying to find the most comprehensive list of the most recent fire events. This one now includes the glass fire, so we will have to see what comes of this next year, but we do try to start preparing for earlier fire seasons, unfortunately. The top photo is our native pigeon, our band-tailed pigeon, and those were some that we were able to take in from Napa Wildlife last year when they had to evacuate during the Hennessy fire. We also prepared our facilities to be able to intake any from other facilities that were evacuating, since we hope to never return the favor that somebody's evacuating, but we have had to evacuate, so we were happy to do so and lend a helping hand. And then also considering that we have falconers in the area and privately permitted, or places like Safari West or zoos, just anywhere that we might be able to also help in those situations. And then this is the same viewpoint in the front of bird rescue. The left is just kind of an overcast day, and then the right was taken from this past year where it seemed that we all lived on Mars for a little bit. So this is something that, besides the immediate fire events, that I am very concerned about, which is the AQI, the smoke, and the air quality. So I have been in discussion now with facilities of all types across the West Coast about the impact of air quality and poor air quality on animals that can't be brought inside. So our resident ambassadors are very much used to their day-to-day life. They have their own individual housing. They like it. It's where they're stress-free. And to have to pull animals inside in a limited facility is something that we just didn't seem that was possible. We would make that decision if it was necessary, but it seems to be that for most places, the answer is to really do the same as the humans had in terms of suggestions, which is to stay stress-free, don't do any physical exercise, just kind of take it easy, not perpetuating some activity that would make you breathe harder and make you breathe in more. We do now have certain protocols if we reach certain levels of the AQI, and we have kind of determinations of when we would really truly need to bring things in. But that's something that is, whether or not there's fire immediately, we have smoke drift from other fires and things like that, so that we've had to prepare for this more than an actual fire event. And in these cases, we do have an oxygen chamber. So normally in a non-fire or smoke event, we have birds that hit windows or hit by car. And so that kind of trauma, we automatically will put them in the oxygen, so that way they can just get that little bit extra. They can de-stress while they're in there. But during these periods of time, we put everybody in there for quite a while, just because we don't know whether birds are traveling from an instance of heavy smoke or fire, or what may be the situation with them. And we've even developed a large chamber so that we could potentially fit multiple patients at once safely, if need be. And so that also is something that we've had reported in terms of birds kind of pushing out of their normal comfort zones. So we would almost immediately have folks calling in and say, I've never had jays in my yard, and now there's a ton of jays. What does that mean? And it could just mean maybe other birds that were evacuating then kind of pushed them out of their normal area. Maybe they are the ones that have evacuated from a potential dangerous situation. And the best thing that we can do is always say, kind of supply extra clean water, make sure that those items are cleaned out with bleach solution, so that way everybody is kind of safe. We're providing extra of what the birds need, but in a safe manner. And this is something that, I kind of discovered, and I hadn't really thought about this. The quote is from National Geographic, but I was able to piece together the fact that obviously our landscape has changed, and physically in terms of our trees, our grasses, sometimes our species. I know that I have a slightly different species representation in my yard now, but also things like the actual streams and bodies of water where the turbidity or water quality or flow or chemistry that actually physically changes everything involved in the environment, and that we are still a part of our environment, and what can we do or that we can look for in order to see what those changes may be. So that is what bird rescue has experienced or noticed for the past few years. We're always continually keeping an eye on just kind of suspicious cases or investigating, okay, this is sort of a strange behavior. Where did you come from? Is it near anything that could have been a fire or flood or smoke event? And things like that. And doing the best that we can to keep track of these seemingly individual instances to see if there's any kind of relation or what kind of relationship that we can create out of them. In the meantime, as I discussed about providing extra support during smoke and fire events in your yard, one thing that we had, unfortunately, this past winter was the Salmonella outbreak. So luckily in our hospital, we haven't seen very much of that lately, if at all, and it is mainly attributed to folks in our community taking down and taking the action to protect our birds by allowing them to continue to move through and move past. And so now we've deemed it safe to go ahead and put feeders and baths back up, but with the caveat that once a week they do need to be emptied and cleaned fully with a bleach solution, let that solution dry, and then everything can be put back up and back in their place. And that does include things like hummingbird feeders as well. There's just, feeders can, if they just sit, they can kind of collect nasty little germs. And then of course, because we are in baby bird season right now, what do you do if you have found a bird, particularly a baby bird? The first thing is to call our hotline at 707-523-2473. We also have a lot of information about common situations, ducklings in pools, or if a bird happened to just fly in through an open window as you're airing out your house. So those kinds of things can also be found on our website. We do now a lot of the time ask that you take a photo of the bird in question and potentially the situation that it's in. So that way we can more quickly identify what kind of bird it is, the age, and maybe what you're seeing as normal or not normal. And as we've been gearing up for a very big baby bird season this year, we've also been gearing up for a big move. So this is a rendition of what we're thinking our education center and hospital center will look like, much different from the very beginning of the presentation with our Quonset hut. And to date, in our Invest in the Skies capital campaign, our total goal is about 6.7 million, and we're already over halfway there. And the final 3 is the most tangible parts of the project. So things like the hospital, the aviaries, and the education installments. And while we don't have a lot of new volunteer opportunities right now, due still to the pandemic and our tight spaces that we have inside, we do ask that whatever you are able to spread the word of bird rescue, if you're able to support the birds that are in our hospital currently or those that will need our help in the future. You can always stay connected by joining our mailing list, finding out more on our website, or you can contact me directly at ashton@thebirdrescuecenter.org.
Ashton, thank you so much. That's so interesting. I really appreciate hearing the stories and learning more about the work going on at the Bird Rescue Center. Are you up for a few questions?
Sure.
Okay, great. There's one that came in early on that piqued my interest as well, and it has to do with corvids. You mentioned that not very many facilities take them in, and the participant in the webinar was asking, why is that? Can you talk more about corvids and wildlife rehabilitation?
So will pick on other species. So that is a big part of it. A lot of people have seen crows or jays kind of picking at a smaller nest of finches or things like that. So that can be one reason that folks don't take in corvids, is that they deal with another species that is more sensitive and sees them as a predator. Another reason would be that they are big and loud, and they are a giant mess. They also, they're so smart that they actually take a little bit longer in a rehab setting as well. So they just require quite a lot in terms of space, your time, a lot of food, and a lot of enrichment items too. So your average baby bird is probably with us for about a month, but crows, especially, and ravens will be probably 2.5. They just need that extra time because they have a whole slew of being super smart, but also too smart for their own good at the same time. So it's a little complicated when we try to get them to the point of release. But, for me, I fell in love with crows and ravens. And so I know that I'm a big proponent of keeping them going at BRC, but those little baby blues, they get me.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think sometimes the corvids have a bad rap and people chase them off from their yards and things like that, but they're so smart. You just kind of have to respect them, I think.
Oh, yes. I have found going into their enclosures sometimes when they're out in our largest enclosures and where we can fit about 15 of them at a time. And so they have this big swinging perch, and there's these big apparatus to keep the perches up and everything. And I walked in one day, and one little nut from the thing that holds it up was just sitting perfectly in the center of their food dish. Like, hi, we did this. Figure it out. So it's always something with those guys.
Giving you a little challenge, giving you some enrichment.
Where did this come from?
Oh, funny. Okay, and another question. There early on, again, why so many more birds, or why were so many more birds coming into the center this year? Do you have any theories about that?
So a lot of that happened in the beginning of the year, definitely with salmonella issue. So we just had this, we usually kind of have a rest period during our winter time, but it sort of switches over from the bulk of baby birds and the hecticness of getting everybody fed every 30 minutes to medically intense raptor cases. But in this instance, this fall and winter, we had so many affected by the salmonella. And last time that happened, in terms of numbers, was probably 2015. We had a total of over 3,200 birds come into the facility during that year. And a lot of that is that it kind of equaled out in terms of the number of birds we received in our winter months, as well as those in the summer. So that instance, we were kind of peak drought, and we had a huge onslaught of robins and thrushes that were eating things that had just turned, and they were not good food for them as they were migrating. And then we also in the later months, we had vultures and eagles and other things that were doing the same thing. They were just scavenging for food, and that food was beyond the point that it was healthy for them to eat, or there were things in that food that were causing them other issues. So our usual amount of babies that we get is about just below 2,000 birds. And so what really kicks up those numbers is the balance of wintertime versus summertime. Right now, we did experience insane levels of birds coming in May. So we usually kind of have this nice sloped increase of birds from 10 to 15 birds per day in May. And then June is really the crazy busy month of 20 to 30 to 40 birds per day. But we were starting to see those numbers in May. So we'll see what the rest of the season brings. I really hope my hospital staff isn't listening to that, but we are, we'll just kind of have to see and then evaluate sort of after the fact what was going on and why were we seeing that, because sometimes in the middle of it we're not able to see what the overall trend is. So we may end up having a fairly decent end of the season. Maybe everybody's having a big boom right now because we're back in this very dry portion of the year. And then maybe they'll move on and they won't have a second or third clutch or something. So we'll just kind of have to see and evaluate afterwards. But
Yeah. You're so busy right now with those gaping mouths, right? You figure it out afterwards. Yeah.
I can't see past them.
Yeah. Okay, and a couple more questions. Let's see. Another question about birds and flying at night. This person mentioned that they've heard birds don't fly at night. So how does that affect their ability to flee fire?
So some birds actually particularly migrate at night. And there have been instances where, of course, I can't remember the reference off the top of my head, but there are certain things that you can look up and you can actually see the migratory patterns. And they have it like from satellite where you can actually see them migrating at night. It's really, really interesting. And so for some, that's just normal. And that's why in some areas they have like a lights out, citywide lights out, or statewide, depending on what birds may be migrating through at night during those particular times. So that way, these huge city buildings that usually leave ambient light on, they make sure to turn all of them off. So that way it doesn't confuse the birds that are migrating and they don't, hit windows and things like that. In terms of the fire events, I think that it would likely be instinctual. So the fact of, in terms of things that I've read or the like, where insects are fleeing first and then the rest of the animals follow, how, this is kind of putting insects down, but how would an insect know to flee? I think there's something innate and instinctual about it. And I think that happens in us as well, but sometimes we kind of forget that it's there, like people that wake up a minute before an earthquake hits or something like that. So I think that that's more of an instinct thing.
Great, thank you. I've seen those migration tracking websites, and I think that'd be a really fun thing for us to look up and share with the participants in our follow-up email.
It's sometimes crazy. It's just,
yeah.
See, they light it up and it's like, how do you not notice? I mean, I'm awake fairly late at night. How do I not hear or see anything? But they're just far enough out of reach, I think, that, or maybe I'm not in the right spots. But
yeah, I've heard them at night. It seems like particularly shorebirds or waterfowl or geese, you can hear them coming in the dark of night, and you're just like, what is going on? So yeah, it'll be fun to share that information with our participants. And then another question just came in about, when is it okay to take down a nest? This participant says, we have a Pacific slope flycatcher nest over our front door. All the birds and eggs are gone. Is it okay to take down the nest?
I would be sure that they're not going to reuse it for the season. So it would be, sometimes birds do reuse nests year after year, but in terms of those right now, I wouldn't be able to say if they were going to have another round of babies at this point. So I would say to reevaluate at the end of the summer, and a great resource for that question would actually be Native Songbird Care and Conservation, because she does specialize in those types of birds. So she might even better say, no, they only ever have one round of babies, it's fine. Or no, they will typically have two, or things like that.
Yeah, yes, Veronica will be a great resource. I would love to share that information too in the follow-up email. Thanks for mentioning her facility. Okay, questions keep rolling in. Do you have a recipe for a diluted bleach solution to use?
So it is a 9-to-1 solution. So it's fairly dilute. I would have to look up exactly what that is in terms of like 1 tablespoon to, whatever gallon of water or something like that. But that's something that I can definitely get to Christine, and that way we can put that out in the follow-up as well.
Okay, great. And this person was also asking if it's on your website. So if not, that might be something great to put up.
If not, it should be. So, it should be right.
I wonder if Native Songbird Care and Rehabilitation probably has that information too.
A lot of us do, especially because all of us were seeing impacts from salmonella and trying to support the most information that we could, not only about the disease, but then how to help prevent it and keep a healthy habitat in the yard. So most of the organizations in the area definitely have not only about salmonella, but also about cleaning as well.
Yeah, that's great. This is a big question. And I think it might be a webinar in itself, but I will go ahead and pose it. How has human action, fire management, city development, etc., impacted wild birds?
Oh,
How have humans played a role in the challenges that birds are facing with fire and in general?
all right.
Where to begin, huh?
Yes, I know. I mean, one instance would be the Rookery of I know from other folks that have been in the area that where the West 9th Street Rookery is currently was not always the place where those birds nested, that they did have another location. Us wonderful humans in the past decided they didn't want those birds there, chopped the whole rookery down when the birds were gone, and then they chose a worse spot. So that would be just one fragment of an instance where human activity definitely affected a wild population. And that's just one tiny little subset of species that we have here in the county. So, any building, anything that we do will ultimately affect the other animals in the world around us. And it would just be a matter of trying to mitigate that effect as much as you possibly can. Sometimes that's may not be possible, but it's trying to kind of right the wrongs, so to speak, of what we've caused. Buildings with windows is another one where that's a main reason why birds come into bird rescue, or window strikes, car strikes, things like that. And so there are things that you can either put up on your window to help prevent birds from running into them. Like I mentioned, kind of the lights out in certain cities where they actively try to turn lights off so that birds don't hit those big city buildings that are covered in windows. There's new technology coming out with ingrained designs and potentially ingrained UV items in the window itself. So that way the birds see it versus seeing a reflection or seeing through it to somewhere where they want to go. This is definitely like a 5-part webinar. So that is a big question, but thank you. That's a good one for sure.
It's habitat fragmentation I always think about too with wildlife in general, is where we're putting our roads in our cities breaks up connectivity for our wildlife. Birds maybe not quite so much because they can fly, but you're right, every time we're reducing habitat in one area, it concentrates the birds, which can cause all kinds of issues. Yeah.
Exactly. I know I was fortunate enough to go to Ecuador, into the Amazon, when I was in college. And we had to, while navigating through the rainforest, we had to follow single file suit in front of our guide. And he knew where he was going. He told us never to deviate because we would just immediately get lost in the forest. But the reason being that even in those areas, if a pathway got too beaten down by humans, then certain species wouldn't even cross that. So it didn't have to be a clear cutting or building a road. It could be simply a trail that got too weathered down, and then certain species of mammals or birds or insects just would not cross that pathway. And then you would be preventing them from, performing their duty in the wild.
Yeah, that might be our follow-up emails talking about, I mean, our follow-up webinar. All right, one more quick question. And it is again about cleaning bird feeders. So can we put bird feeders in the dishwasher? Does it have to be a bleach solution, or how about putting feeders in the dishwasher?
I would think that as long as your dishwasher is getting to a point of sanitizing, then that's fine. I don't personally put my bird feeders in the dishwasher, but if that's something you're comfortable with, then I think that that would be okay.
Okay. Oh, and one more came in. Let's see. And in general, I think while we're kind of talking about bird feeders, what are your thoughts about bird feeders in general? Are they vectors for disease? And they often are attracting birds closer to our yards, in our windows. But then there's that balance of we get to know and love and care about, and hopefully then conserve habitat for birds. So what would be maybe your personal hat or your bird rescue center hat about bird feeders?
I think for my bird rescue center hat, I know that they aren't essential to bird life. Bird feeders didn't exist at the same time that birds evolved. So they have evolved to withstand life without feeders. I know that in my heart of hearts. Do I have a bird feeder personally? Yes. I really enjoy seeing the birds at my feeder. And if I recognize that there's going to be a little too much activity, then I do have another one that I might put up. But so far, so good. Everybody, it's generally loose enough where they're not completely crowding over one another. But it is a space that causes congregation of species. So we do see feeder diseases, basically, for a lack of better term, and they are transferred there. So the big example that all of us saw was the salmonella, but there are things that we see on a regular basis that can be transferred between finches, that can be transferred between species, and it is just, if you're congregating like that in any species of animal, then there is a greater chance of spreading a disease around. So that's why even if you have one up, then to take it down and clean it regularly throughout the year, that's their best chance of maintaining a healthy environment, even though they're using a seed feeder or any other feeder. Like I said, I clean my hummingbird feeder once a week at least as well. It ends up being more than that because they drain it pretty fast, but and I try to have folks think about the placement of the feeders. I know you mentioned near windows and other things. So if it is an issue of they get scared by something, a predator, and there is the bump on the window, then it might be a consideration to move it either farther away or a different height or a different area of the yard, something like that, that would be farther away from kind of a secondary injury. One thing that if you do have potentially a kitty cat that goes outdoors is to consider a catio instead, so that they can enjoy the outdoors without kind of having a wonderful seed feeder where all the birds come to and congregate to. So that typically doesn't really happen, but just in case, to throw it out there, that would be another concern about having a feeder specifically and where the birds congregate.
Mm-hmm. I'll just also put a plug in for planting native plants in your yard. If you're planting food plants for our native wildlife, you're still going to attract the birds. and then also create more biodiversity and more opportunities for other critters to come into your yard. So I'm going to put a plug in for native plants in your landscape.
Yes, and that's definitely something, you know, especially over the past several years with these fire events, that it's been more prevalent on people's minds, I think, to have something that can withstand or be, you know, water solvent and things like that, where not only is it helping your very local environment in terms of water efficiency and potential fire management, but also our native birds as well.
I think someone just posted a question about bird water features in your yard, like fountains and things like that. Same kind of situation as bird feeders.
That has been the conundrum of, you know, if it's a water bath that can be easily, you know, dumped and cleaned for sure, doing the once a week cleaning. I have been trying to ask around and see if there is something for active water features where that's not possible, or those that have like a koi pond or something like that, in being able to try to help in that situation. I don't have a good answer for that at the moment, other than to continue to monitor the birds in your yard and be sure if you see, like in that one PowerPoint slide, I had the two pine siskins, and one kind of looked very sleek and healthy, and he's about to jet off into the world, and then the other kind of looked puffy and sort of sad. So the kind of puffy appearance is what a sick or injured bird may look like in your yard. And that would be something where to keep an eye on that situation. So if it's, you know, one, then that can happen. They could have flown in from somewhere else. But if you have a bunch of them, then that's definitely something to take a look at and say, okay, you know, how can I best provide the best environment?
Thank you. I really enjoyed your presentation. I have a personal fondness for the Bird Rescue Center and so appreciate all the work that you do, all of your staff, your board of directors, and all your volunteers do to promote the health and well-being of native bird species in Sonoma County. So it was a personal pleasure for me to talk with you and to host this webinar, and we look forward to having you back at another time. Thank you all for your participation tonight. We will follow up with an email that'll have some links to more resources for you. It'll be a few days before we get that email out to you, and a few days before this webinar is posted to YouTube, but keep an eye on your email for that message. Also want to let you know we do have some more upcoming community education events. There's a vernal pool workday at the end of the month. Right now, the workday is already filled, but if you want to join the wait list for that, it'd be a great opportunity to help the native species thrive in the vernal pools. We're going to take a little bit of a break in our community education programs for the month of July so we can focus all of our education efforts to run our summer program, Camp Thule. So it's already full. We're looking forward to a great summer with the kids. We'll be returning with more webinars and more in-person programming starting in August. I know we just scheduled a rattlesnake webinar for mid-August. So stay tuned to lagunafoundation.org. Keep an eye on your email for our community events only emails. And we look forward to seeing you at another webinar or an in-person event sometime soon. Again, check out the Bird Rescue Center website at birdrescuecenter.org and the Laguna Foundation website, lagunafoundation.org. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you all.